Hello from our own correspondent studios at Broadcasting House in London. You've downloaded the latest edition of the programme, broadcast on BBC Radio 4. It's introduced by Kate Adie.
Today, assassinations, abductions, explosions. The world may no longer be paying attention, but the revolution in Libya is far from over. There's growing foreboding in Central Asia. What will happen when NATO troops pull out of Afghanistan? The reporter who broke the rules and handed over money so a baby could eat. And the Paris Boulevard, once dubbed the most beautiful in the world. Our correspondent says, don't go there. It's crass, styleless, expensive and naff. There's been plenty more evidence this week that Libya is still struggling with the lawlessness that's plagued it since the overthrow of Colonel Gaddafi in 2011. Yesterday, a car bomb exploded outside the Swedish consulate in Benghazi. Earlier, the country's Prime Minister, Ali Zadan, was seized by gunmen in the centre of the capital, Tripoli. He was later released unharmed, saying his abduction was part of an attempted coup. Tim Hewell's been telling us how it all reminds him of another conflict long ago and far away.
In 1900, at the height of the Boer War, my grandmother was 13, and one of her favourite memories later in life was of watching her mother, a no-nonsense Lancashire barmaid, berate a hapless young newspaper vendor on a street corner who was innocently trying to shift 100 copies of the Oldham Evening Chronicle with the latest on the British advance in South Africa. "Relief of Ladysmith! Relief of Ladysmith!" Menacingly, she jabbed at the boy with her umbrella and demanded, "Who is this bloomin' Lady Smith anyway? And why the heck should I care if she's relieved?" I thought of that story often 2 years ago as the current cream of foreign correspondents, and me, reported on another sensational yet ephemeral chain of victories at the other extremity of the African continent, along the desolate desert road that runs hundreds of miles along Libya's coast, the unglamorous face of the Med. Teenage boys having better things to do nowadays than sell newspapers. It was that strapline at the bottom of our TV screens that shouted, "Capture of Ras Al Hanouf! Rebels take Bin Jawad!" Ras Al Hanouf? Bin Jawad? In normal times, a camel wouldn't stop long in those baking villages. And they haven't seen many journalists either, since Colonel Gaddafi was killed further up the road. But this week Libya became a headline again, when the Prime Minister was briefly kidnapped by a militia. Of course, the militias never went away. They're the same rebels who fought Gaddafi 2 years ago, who now threaten the very government they replaced him with. They regularly besiege ministries in pursuit of various demands. Around Ras Al Hanouf, for the last 2 months, they've been blockading oil terminals, depriving their own country of $130 million revenue a day. Their aim this time? To win home rule and the lion's share of the oil wealth for their eastern region, Cyrenaica. Every time I meet a militiaman, I ask what he did before the war. The kindly-looking white-bearded commander who's locked down one of the terminals used to buy and sell cars. So why doesn't he go back to that? It paid better. "I can't put down my gun," he says, "when our revolution's in danger." But who's the revolution in danger from? Many think it's the militias themselves. Benghazi, the capital of Cyrenaica, the cradle of the revolution, is now a city of uncertainty and fear. Popular protest forced the militias to close their bases there after they were accused of involvement in the attack on the US consulate in which the ambassador died. But their gunmen haven't gone away, and no state authority has moved in to take control. Almost daily there are assassinations. Police stations are blown up. A young doctor I got to know 2 years ago, passionate then about the prospects for the new Libya, is now moving to Canada, one of many leaving the country. He says armed gangs terrorise the hospitals. A colleague was stabbed in the thigh for supposedly giving inadequate care. A gunman burst into an operating theatre and shot the patient in the head as he lay on the table. Meanwhile, the former spokeswoman of the first rebel government tells me stories of intimidation at the university. Confident, liberal, outward-looking, I thought of her then as a symbol of the revolution. I assumed she'd have a great future in Libya's new democratic politics. But she's retreated from public life, like other women who rose with the uprising. She's gone back to her old job as a lecturer. But students, she says, threaten her whenever she tries to improve the curriculum. They don't want to work harder. And her students, like almost everyone else in Libya, have got guns. At every level, then, from the Prime Minister down, it's a picture of authority being held to ransom. Normal, some say, after any revolution. Inevitable, perhaps, after 42 years in Gaddafi's straitjacket. Frightening, certainly, for many Libyans. And disappointing, too, for us, because Benghazi was saved 2 years ago from Gaddafi's bloody revenge by French and British missiles. The UK spent £212 million on that military campaign. The long-distance foreign involvement is partly why we covered every dusty, dangerous mile of that long desert road, and why I ended up remembering Lady Smith and her sudden comforture. But the relief of Ras Al Hanouf would have been even more puzzling to my great-grandmother as she pulled the pints for her claque in the Crown and Cushion.
Tim Hewell, back now from Benghazi in Libya. Burma, or Myanmar as it's also known, continues to be a place of quite spectacular change. This week the news was less about its fast-developing economy, more about an agreement with a rebel group which has spent years battling the government for control of their tribal areas in the north. But on the economic front, the country's prospects are being transformed. A steady stream of foreign investors and donors are flying in, keen to do business. But as Jonathan Head's been finding out, for all the talk, there isn't a lot of money flowing in yet.
There are very few big cities left in Asia, where from a top-floor vantage point you can still see palm trees and wooden boats puttering along a brown river. A skyline marked out not by concrete and glass towers, but by the turrets and brickwork of colonial architecture and by golden Buddhist stupas. Yangon still has this view, but it won't be for long. Construction cranes now swing across newly cleared patches of ground all over the city. Its battered old roads are clogged by a recent invasion of imported cars. And in stylishly renovated old buildings, there are new bars and restaurants feeding an eclectic crowd of NGO workers, young Burmese entrepreneurs and foreign venture capitalists. They're calling Myanmar the last untapped opportunity in Asia, a market of 60 million people in need of pretty much everything. Those brave enough to jump in first, goes the thinking, will reap the richest rewards. But just who is getting rich on this buccaneering new frontier? The biggest numbers are being thrown around by the Japanese. You can't move in Yangon without bumping into yet another coachload of Japanese businessmen eagerly taking notes and snapshots. Every week there's another grand announcement from corporate Japan, a planned factory here, a new power station there. The government in Tokyo is throwing aid at Myanmar, offering to upgrade anything from its railways to its national grid. While the country was under international sanctions, Japan had to grit its teeth and watch as its arch-rival China courted the then military government for deals and favours. You get the strong impression that it's rushing in now to make up for those lost years. Rushing in, but not with much actual cash yet. The Burmese call us NATO, says Masaki Takahara, the genial head of JETRO, the export promotion arm of the Japanese government. No action, talk only. Or he says we're called the 4 L's. Look, listen, learn, and leave. Much the same is true of British businesses. There are almost constant trade missions. 18 smaller companies in one earlier this month, the Lord Mayor of London just the other day. But little real investment. Why not? There are some very basic infrastructure problems. Myanmar is chronically short of electricity. One local factory owner showed me the 3 generators he uses to keep his 1,500 garment workers employed during the frequent blackouts. But he explained his fuel costs are so high that even with the lowest wages in Southeast Asia, it's a struggle to make a profit. Then there's the shortage of suitable buildings. As a result, office rents in downtown Yangon are as high as in New York and much higher than in neighbouring Bangkok. There's confusion over the rules of doing business too. The banking system is so primitive that payments are often made with bags full of cash. Of course, the same problems confront Burmese businesses. But after living for so many years under the suffocating blanket of sanctions and military rule, their mood is ebullient. I found myself sitting one evening with a group of well-heeled women in a luxury spa, sipping champagne and listening to their business triumphs. One woman had left school at 17 to help bring up her younger brothers. Today, she's the brand manager for a European cosmetics giant. Another young entrepreneur I met had returned recently from Britain to help run a multi-million investment fund, but has decided to try developing mobile banking services as well, in a country where mobile phones have become available even before most people have the internet or regular electricity. His office sits in a half-built technology park surrounded by trees and tropical mud. And then there was 27-year-old Thierry, who runs a phone shop and blazes with ambition. She told me she's taking management classes for 2 hours every evening after work. It was all very uplifting, reinforcing the impression of a country eager to move on. But it is only a small fraction of Myanmar's people who are riding this wave. A boat ride across the vast floodplain of the Irrawaddy Delta brought me to a small temple school, funded by a donation from a local NGO and entirely surrounded by water. The children paddled to class in dugout canoes, but before it was built last year, they didn't go to school at all during the rainy season. Their parents are farmers and labourers. Their village has no electricity and little in the way of health care. I asked the abbot of the temple what all the recent changes in the country meant to him. He had to think for a few seconds. Well, nothing, he said, except for this school. That's all we got.
Jonathan Head in Burma. Police in the Indian state of Uttar Pradesh have now arrested more than 100 people after fighting broke out between Hindus and Muslims last month. Those detained include a number of local politicians accused of inciting the violence, which has left more than 40 people dead. Joanna Jolly has been to the area to report on the aftermath of the fighting, and listening to accounts of violence and suffering, she found herself becoming involved in ways she hadn't expected.
My local colleague, Joydeep, told me that amidst the violence, there was a story of hope here. We had found anger on both sides of the divide in the town of Muzaffarnagar, neighbour pitted against neighbour, rioters on the streets. At first, all seemed normal. Dogs were barking. There was a power cut. But it didn't take long to find resentment. On the Hindu side, the community known as Jats, they insisted the Muslims had been favoured by local politicians. But then the Muslims told us that they'd been betrayed. In a madrasa, an Islamic religious school, we met hundreds of Muslim men who'd fled their homes and were living rough in the school's courtyard. A community leader told us that for decades, Muslims and Hindus had lived together peacefully. But now, he said, they feared for their lives. As he spoke, a crowd of maybe 100 men formed around us. They pressed in closely. Joydeep whispered he was worried. It was time we left. But first, we wanted to investigate that story of hope. We followed some of the men over streams of filthy water into a group of small brick houses, through an iron gate into a courtyard. There, in the arms of a 7-year-old boy, was a tiny baby. The men said the girl had been found 10 days ago in a ditch. Her umbilical cord was still attached, and she was being mauled by dogs. They were convinced she was a Hindu child, and said it was only the generosity of a good Muslim woman that had kept her alive. The woman had taken her in, even though she had 8 children of her own. I wanted to meet this woman, so the men pushed her forward. She was small but well built. Joydeep, who was translating, said she was 36, but she seemed decades older. We asked the men to leave us so we could talk to her. They stood back, but still didn't give us much space. The woman sat down and held the baby in her arms. The child was dressed in a red top far too big for her and a small green hat. Her eyelids had been painted black with coal. She was tiny and hardly made a sound. Her skin was yellow, presumably from jaundice. "You have so many children," I asked. "Why look after one more?" "I'm hoping she'll grow up to go to school and study," she said. "I hope she's clever and can get a government job. Then she can look after me," she smiled. I looked at the tiny, sickly baby and wondered if she'd survive at all. I couldn't see any food in the courtyard, nor anything suggesting there was money to look after her. We have a rule as journalists not to give anything, usually, to the people we interview, and it's a rule I've always followed. But the thought of the baby not having food was too much for me. I want to give money, I said to Joydeep. He looked around nervously at the crowd of men pressing in. Do what you need to, he said, but do it quickly. Pretending to put a camera into my backpack, I reached inside and scrunched up a banknote in my hand. It was no more than you'd pay for a sandwich in London, but here it could feed the baby for a few weeks. I held out my hand and offered it to the mother in a handshake. At first she looked puzzled. It's not usual to shake hands with a woman in India. But then she felt the scratch of paper in her palm, and she realised what I was doing. By now Joydeep was very nervous. We have to go, he said. The group of men surged round us as we moved back to our car. One man stood in front of me, furiously demanding money. Just as I was beginning to wonder whether he'd hit me, I felt a warm touch around my stomach. It was the woman. She leant her head on my shoulder, affectionately it seemed, and slowly but surely she guided me through the angry crowd. Keep the money secret, I whispered. Keep it for yourself. She wouldn't let me go. Another man started shouting in my face. She held me even closer, and she didn't let me go until I was safely inside our car. The money I had given her was nothing. Certainly it wouldn't make much difference. I wasn't expecting anything in return, but I felt she'd repaid me 100 times over, with a kindness and strength that humbled me.
And that was Joanna Jolly. There's a growing sense of foreboding in several Central Asian countries as NATO troops continue their withdrawal from Afghanistan. We know that all US combat troops are due out by the end of the year, but we don't yet know what that'll mean for Afghanistan and its neighbours. This week, one Russian newspaper said it had seen a secret Kremlin report suggesting that thousands of Taliban and other jihadist fighters had already crossed over from Afghanistan into Tajikistan. James Kumarasamy has just been to the border between those two countries to see what preparations are being made for the post-NATO era. He met one man who has already been on the receiving end of cross-border violence.
With his square green embroidered tubicheka hat, loose-fitting lilac jacket and blue striped running shoes, he was an unlikely-looking shepherd. An even more unlikely-looking action hero. In fact, his physical resemblance to the actor John Cleese gave him the air of a cinematic anti-hero. But earlier this year, this 61-year-old Tajik shepherd had encountered 3 armed Afghan militants and survived. He told me his story in the eastern town of Kulyab, the nearest a foreigner can get to the closed, unstable area between Tajikistan and Afghanistan where he tends his flock. We met in the early evening, the sustained, almost hypnotic twittering of birds providing an oddly calming backdrop to his dramatic tale. He took some time to tell it, savouring every detail of how he and 3 friends were captured and tied up by the Kalashnikov-wielding Afghans. He'd never known his captors' intentions, but guessed they had decided to kidnap him for cash or kill him for sport. He chuckled and gestured, hopping on one training shoe, as he showed me how the Afghans had ordered him to swap his flimsy sandals for rubber boots for what he expected was going to be a difficult march ahead, but they couldn't find a pair that fit. And he grew animated as he described the fight which followed, from its confused beginning with one Afghan slipping, one shackled Tajik grabbing and shots being fired, to its clear conclusion. 3 Afghans and 1 Tajik dead, the shepherd and 2 of his friends alive. There have been other incidents of this kind, and local villagers fear that there will be many more when the Americans conclude their homeward trek. To find out how prepared the Tajik authorities are, I travelled 4.5 hours from Kulyab along rutted roads to the border post which spans the river Pyandj. There I had watched Tajik border guards in action. Not that there had been much action to see. As the senior officer and I sauntered across the US-funded Friendship Bridge, everything seemed perfectly friendly. A few NATO trucks rumbled southwards into Afghanistan, while nothing more menacing than a minibus with a few smiling Afghan men on board came the other way. Since the bridge was opened in 2007, we were told, the main difference had been a welcome influx of exotic fruits, not seen by Tajiks for years. When the officer showed us their simple customs building, where identity papers are scoured and a bear-like doctor with a dangling blue face mask consults a wall chart to check whether new arrivals have symptoms of infectious diseases, he seemed perfectly calm. But standing over the water on the Afghan border itself, ripples of concern began spreading across his face. Come next year, he believes, the exotic fruits will be replaced by less benign cargoes. When the Americans leave, I'm sure there'll be chaos, he said, gazing ruefully into Afghan territory. The fighting between their clans, their gangs, and the Taliban will begin again. Our life will become much more difficult. The Tajiks insist that they are ready, but according to one of the guards, Central Asia's poorest country only has 2 helicopters to patrol its 800-mile border with Afghanistan. Sniffer dogs are being trained for the expected spike in drug traffic, which has already been increasing even with the American troops in the area. As we drove east to meet the shepherd, skirting along the edge of the border zone, we were twice stopped at checkpoints by bored-looking soldiers sitting at the kind of tables you'd see at a school fair entrance. They hardly seemed coiled and ready to repel unwelcome visitors. Shy schoolgirls scurried by, wearing floor-length black and white dresses and shielding their faces from the sun and from us with their textbooks. Men sat in the shade, chewing the local green tobacco called nos, an unappetizing pulp made from something resembling whitewash and fresh tobacco leaves. The soldiers chewed over our British passports, more out of curiosity than menace, meticulously copying every detail into a folder whose final destination remained a mystery. What's also uncertain at this point is the effect of NATO's withdrawal from Afghanistan. That makes it hard for bordering countries such as Tajikistan to draw up detailed contingency plans. But our local hero shepherd is in no doubt how he wants to prepare. It's not my generation I'm worried about, he insisted. It's my children's. So tell our government to give us weapons and we'll defend our land ourselves. And as he strode off in his blue running shoes, I got the impression that part of him was looking forward to his next encounter with Afghan gunmen and to telling the story of how the Afghans came off second best.
James Kumarasamy in Tajikistan. Now, what's the most famous street in the world? Arguably, it's the Champs-Élysées in Paris, a mile-long boulevard of exclusive cafes, glittering designer shops and clipped horse-chestnut trees. It's one of the city's main tourist attractions, with the Arc de Triomphe at one end and the Place de la Concorde at the other. Every year, tens of millions of visitors come to shop, stroll and savour being in what's often called the most beautiful avenue in the world. So why isn't our Paris correspondent Hugh Schofield also in love with this celebrated slice of real estate? Well, let's let him explain.
I think I'm getting a reputation as the local nutter. Down the end of the street where the BBC office is situated, on the corner with the Champs-Élysées, someone recently got authorization to run an on-street business venture that has my blood boiling. Every morning there are 3 or 4 ultra-expensive, brightly coloured open-top sports cars, Lamborghinis or Mazzaginis or something, with the words "Drive Me" painted on the side. Some rapper-style individuals lounge around in garments bearing the logo "Dream on Board." Can you think of a more clunking, ugly slogan than "Dream on Board"? That's the new globalised English for you. Anyway, it obviously works, because there's a constant small crowd of tourists gathered around, taking pictures of themselves and their friends in front of these garish totems of abject ostentation, and occasionally one of them will shell out the €90 and go for a closely supervised spin around the block. So why am I becoming the local loony? Because every morning when I cycle past I can't help grinding my teeth and snarling, a bit like the elderly Clint Eastwood in the film Gran Torino, and muttering not so sotto voce pathetic interjections such as "it's only a car," in the direction of the gawking tourists and the preening minders who, when they hear me, stare back in total bewilderment. What planet is he on, is the general drift. But you see, Dream on Board to me is the modern Champs-Élysées. Crass, styleless, expensive, but naff. A year or two ago, I spotted a long line of people outside an elegant, early 19th century building down the bottom end near Avenue Montaigne. Aha, I thought, maybe a new gallery, or some rich philanthropist has opened his mansion for the elevation of the masses. But no, this particular Hôtel Particulier had been acquired by a well-known American clothing company, and to this day the queues of shoppers, some of them oddly Americans, still stretch round the block, while the narcissistic boy greeters, turning vanity into an art form, pose with swooning young females from Colombia or Taiwan. Lest you take this as the cantankerous rambling of a xenophobic sourpuss, let me assure you that most Parisians feel exactly the same way as I do. Most Parisians don't go to the Champs-Élysées, except maybe at Christmas to see the lights. They know it's crowded, stressful, overpriced, essentially a place for people not from the city to get a glimpse of an imaginary Paris that doesn't actually exist. Indeed, it's a standing joke at the BBC that if you want to go through that essential journalistic ritual known as the vox pop, what the French call micro-trottoir, pavement microphone, what you don't do is go to Paris's most famous street. Why? Because you'll find it very hard to identify anyone on the Champs-Élysées who's actually French. One person who I know agrees with me is Florian Anselme, author of a recent book called The Hidden Life of the Champs-Élysées. He bemoaned to me the loss of the old Champs, where Parisians would come and flâner, stroll beneath the plane trees, take a coffee, meet friends, go window shopping outside the luxury stores, all rather charming and French. 30 years ago, he said, when Jacques Chirac was mayor, it started changing. The big brands came in. Gulf Arabs began buying up the property. The flâneur flâned away. And what they left behind is also, in parts, increasingly insalubrious. The Rue de Ponthieu, for example, a side street of the Champs-Élysées, though taking its romantic-sounding name from a northern French dukedom that was once the appanage of medieval kings of England, now has a line of nightclubs favoured by footballers, the banlieue drug-rich, and escort girls. Transplanted to modern-day Paris, the caricaturist William Hogarth would have done a wonderful drawing there on the evils of cocaine, violence, and electronic music played at very loud volumes. The young woman I saw urinating in the gutter at 7 a.m. last Sunday would probably have featured. It's all a great shame, because the Champs-Élysées, the Elysian Fields, after all, is in its conception a majestic piece of town planning. The long vista is still breathtaking, and in the lower part, where the gardens are, it remains pretty much unchanged. But too long has it rested on its laurels, like some corrupt late Roman emperor. Today, if I'm asked by first-time visitors where they should go in Paris, my advice is clear. Love the Louvre, marvel at the Marais, elate at the Ile de la Cité, and get an eyeful of the Eiffel. But as Lewis Carroll said of the frumious Bandersnatch, shun the Champs-Élysées.
Unequivocal advice there from our man in Paris, Hugh Schofield. And with that, we're done. Back next week on both Thursday and Saturday with more from around the world. Until then, goodbye.
$1 revenue a day. Their aim this time? To win home rule and the lion's share of the oil wealth for their eastern region, Cyrenaica. Every time I meet a militiaman, I ask what he did before the war. The kindly-looking white-bearded commander who's locked down one of the terminals used to buy and sell cars. So why doesn't he go back to that? It paid better. I can't put down my gun, he says, when our revolution's in danger. But who's the revolution in danger from? Many think it's the militias themselves. Benghazi, the capital of Cyrenaica, the cradle of the revolution, is now a city of uncertainty and fear. Popular protest forced the militias to close their bases there after they were accused of involvement in the attack on the US consulate, in which the ambassador died. But their gunmen haven't gone away, and no state authority has moved in to take control. Almost daily there are assassinations. Police stations are blown up. A young doctor I got...
Hello from our own correspondent studios at Broadcasting House in London. You've downloaded the latest edition of the programme, broadcast on BBC Radio 4. It's introduced by Kate Adie.
Today, assassinations, abductions, explosions. The world may no longer be paying attention, but the revolution in Libya is far from over. There's growing foreboding in Central Asia. What will happen when NATO troops pull out of Afghanistan? The reporter who broke the rules and handed over money so a baby could eat. And the Paris Boulevard, once dubbed the most beautiful in the world. Our correspondent says, don't go there. It's crass, styleless, expensive and naff. There's been plenty more evidence this week that Libya is still struggling with the lawlessness that's plagued it since the overthrow of Colonel Gaddafi in 2011. Yesterday, a car bomb exploded outside the Swedish consulate in Benghazi. Earlier, the country's Prime Minister, Ali Zadan, was seized by gunmen.
Of the African continent, along the desolate desert road that runs hundreds of miles along Libya's coast, the unglamorous face of the Med. Teenage boys having better things to do nowadays than sell newspapers. It was that strapline at the bottom of our TV screens that shouted, "Capture of Ras Al-Hanouf! Rebels take Bin Jawad!" Ras Al-Hanouf? Bin Jawad? In normal times, a camel wouldn't stop long in those baking villages. And they haven't seen many journalists either, since Colonel Gaddafi was killed further up the road. But this week Libya became a headline again, when the Prime Minister was briefly kidnapped by a militia. Of course, the militias never went away. They're the same rebels who fought Gaddafi 2 years ago, who now threaten the very government they replaced him with. They regularly besiege ministries in pursuit of various demands. Around Ras Al-Hanouf, for the last 2 months, they've been blockading oil terminals, depriving their own country of 130 million. 2 years ago, passionate then about the prospects for the new Libya, is now moving to Canada, one of many leaving the country. He says armed gangs terrorise the hospitals. A colleague was stabbed in the thigh for supposedly giving inadequate care. A gunman burst into an operating theatre and shot the patient in the head as he lay on the table. Meanwhile, the former spokeswoman of the first rebel government tells me stories of intimidation at the university. Confident, liberal, outward-looking, I thought of her then as a symbol of the revolution. I assumed she'd have a great future in Libya's new democratic politics. But she's retreated from public life, like other women who rose with the uprising. She's gone back to her old job as a lecturer. But students, she says, threaten her whenever she tries to improve the curriculum. They don't want to work harder. And her students, like almost everyone else in Libya, have got guns. At every level, then, from the Prime Minister down.
In the centre of the capital, Tripoli. He was later released unharmed, saying his abduction was part of an attempted coup. Tim Hewell's been telling us how it all reminds him of another conflict long ago and far away.
In 1900, at the height of the Boer War, my grandmother was 13, and one of her favourite memories later in life was of watching her mother, a no-nonsense Lancashire barmaid, berate a hapless young newspaper vendor on a street corner who was innocently trying to shift 100 copies of the Oldham Evening Chronicle with the latest on the British advance in South Africa. "Relief of Ladysmith! Relief of Ladysmith!" Menacingly, she jabbed at the boy with her umbrella and demanded, "Who is this bloomin' Lady Smith anyway? And why the heck should I care if she's relieved?" I thought of that story often 2 years ago as the current cream of foreign correspondents, and me, reported on another sensational yet ephemeral chain of victories at the other extremity.